And I, as the scientist of the group, will be starting with just a brief overview of the nature of artificial intelligence, because I think an accurate working understanding of AI is an essential foundation if we're going to grapple with the bigger questions that its use raises. So, what is AI? In the popular imagination, the term AI typically brings to mind images of robots that can think like humans, an image perhaps fueled by the abundance of dystopian sci fi movies. But I'm going to start with a premise here that will help us see it in a truer light. Namely, that artificial intelligence describes a behavior of digital technologies, the ability to perform tasks that are commonly associated with living, intelligent beings. These are the kinds of tasks that involve recognizing patterns, generalizing, learning from past experience, or solving problems. AI is usually specific just to one task or a small set of tasks. This is called weak AI, and it's typically also dependent on a high degree of human input. So in other words, you're just outsourcing a particular sub-process to a machine. It's not really doing anything on its own. So rather than Blade Runner, we're talking about the kind of thing that perhaps an Alexa can do. You ask a question and its algorithms will offer you a solution. But within AI research and practice, there's also a sub-project that aims to develop strong AI systems. These not only perform behaviors that we associate with intelligence, but actually possess a human-like intelligence, including characteristics that we would say distinguish living human beings, such as perhaps some form of self-awareness. It's beyond the scope of my introduction today to get into the precise boundaries of what human intelligence is, let alone human consciousness. But for now, it's enough to draw this distinction between weak and strong, which serve different purposes, and we will see later in our conversation today, raise different ethical questions for us. But there's good reason that in popular discourse, there's often a blurry boundary between the two. This is an equivocation that actually arose at the very origin of the field of artificial intelligence research. Historians tend to date the birth of AI to the middle of the 20th century with the work of one Alan Turing. Turing was a mathematician and a polymath who trained and later became a fellow at England's greatest university. He's perhaps most famous for his code cracking work for Britain during World War II. But before the war, while he was at Cambridge, he came up with what is now called a Turing machine, a machine that could move from one state to another using a precise and finite set of rules, and depending on just a single symbol that it would read from a tape. Essentially, what he was describing in this paper is a modern computer, but far before the development of the attendant technology, which is just amazing. And from the start, Turing was fascinated by the implications of such computing machines, and specifically the question, can machines think? But rather than trying to get to the bottom of this question, Turing argued that it should be replaced by another. Namely, can a machine do what we as thinking entities do? So this reduction to behavior forms the basis for the Turing test, which we'll hear about again later on in our conversation from Professor Wales. But if we jump forward to our modern day, with every year that goes by, we can answer yes to this question, can machines do what we as thinking entities do, across increasingly many domains of intelligent behavior. To understand how that's possible, it's useful to know a little bit about how AI is developed. So the backbone of AI is something called machine learning. In machine learning, computer systems apply complex mathematics to massive amounts of data in order to learn how to make predictions or decisions without human oversight. Much of contemporary machine learning is modeled after the human brain, and specifically the computational abilities of networks of brain cells, or neurons. So on the right here, you see a diagram of a neuron. Neurons have many little branches that you see over on the left, where they receive information through chemical transmission from other neurons. They then integrate this information and transmit it in the form of electrical currents that run down their axon, which is the long projection that you see extending over to the right. Even one single neuron can encode complex stimuli by changing the intensity and the rate of its firing. But your brain actually has 86 billion of them, organized into many different networks. And this underlies, on a biological level, the cognitive function of your brain. So this massive computational power is one reason that artificial neural networks are an attractive approach for those who develop artificial intelligent technologies. It's something that you could actually do at home if you know how to use a single programming language. So say you're designing a neural network that can recognize pictures of the Golden Dome on campus at Notre Dame. The steps would be pretty simple. First, you need to obtain a database that your network can learn from. So in this case, it would be many images of campus, including images of the Golden Dome and other buildings. Then you would construct a framework for your network. This begins with what's called an input layer, which is a set of information processing units that receive raw data. In this case, it would be the image files. Then you tell these units to transform the data a certain way. So in our example, you'd want the layer to pick up on any elements that are common across all images of the dome. Then they would transmit this information to the next layer of the network. And at each successive hidden layer of the network, this information is combined in complex ways, representing grosser and grosser features of the dome, until eventually we would reach our output layer, which would make a prediction based on the features of the photo of whether or not it contains the golden dome. Once you've got your structure, you need to train the network, though, by feeding it images that you've already labeled as dome or not dome. And the network will then use this data to update its own structure and modify its behavior to improve its prediction accuracy. And then you're ready to go, and you can use this network to analyze images of Notre Dame's campus that it's never seen before. Before we move on, I want to draw your attention to two important things about constructing neural networks and machine learning in general. The first is that AI doesn't arise in a vacuum, but actually from a strong set of assumptions and decisions of the person who's programming it. But secondly, also, if we know the structure of the network and even the end goal of the system, we're still unable to precisely predict what the system's going to do to reach that end. So in other words, much of artificial intelligence is inherently unpredictable. And these two aspects do color a lot of our ethical landscape when it comes to AI. And this landscape is broad because machine learning is an essential tool in research and engineering across a wide range of sectors. One simple but important application would be in medical diagnoses. By training artificial neural networks on thousands of clinical data sets that top radiologists have previously classified, software engineers have developed tools that can correctly diagnose the pathologies contained in chest x-rays, in some cases even better than doctors. And we've been able to make particularly rapid progress in recent years because of an increase in computational power. Like when the term AI was developed, the most advanced computer could perform only 400,000 operations per second, whereas a modern supercomputer can do something like 30 quadrillion. So this allows for increasingly complex computations. But this increase in computing power can also come at a price. For one, as we increase the hidden layers in a neural network, its behavior becomes hard to interpret. That might not seem like a big deal, but think, for instance, of banks that are using AI to decide who gets a loan. When it's not clear what the deciding factors are, this can hide bias. And there's also concern, to return to our example of medical diagnosis, that reliance on machine learning could supplant human wisdom. But one particularly lively question, especially in my field of neuroscience, is the possible effects that the use of AI might have on human intelligence. The idea that technology has detrimental effects on our minds stretches back millennia. We can just think of Socrates and Plato's Phaedo, who thought that the use of writing would reduce our ability to socialize and to exercise reason. A contemporary echo of which can perhaps be found in the concern that Facebook is degrading our social abilities. But it's an open research question of whether reliance on technology can limit our cognitive functions, something that is commonly called cognitive atrophy. But preliminary research indicates that this is indeed the case, especially when AI is closely coupled with human cognition. And it's particularly interesting when we think about the elderly and children, something that I do all the time as a developmental neuroscientist. So for instance, is it possible that a child who grows up with constant access to Google Maps and never has to navigate on his or her own terms from point A to point B might not develop the same navigational abilities? That said, AI can be used to enhance our cognition in sophisticated ways too. Research in cognitive neuroscience has shown that reliance on things like Google doesn't eliminate tasks, it redesigns them. So in other words, it shifts what our minds and brains need to work on from remembering information to remembering ways to access that information. And there's potential to enhance a range of cognitive domains by offloading, so to speak, onto AI in this manner. And these benefits will continue to improve as research in AI advances. New methods and insights in neuroscience, along with rapid advances in computer processing speed and memory, offer continuous improvements to AI technologies. That said, as a neuroscientist myself, I must say that artificial neural networks and similar technologies are still very far from the complexity of the human brain, which in turn is far from the complexity that exists. What we understand is only a fraction of it. And on the level of cognition too, AI is pretty far from human intelligence. Our cognitive abilities remain broader and more flexible than what artificial technologies can mimic. in particular across three domains. The first would be transferring skills, so shifting from one task to another and preserving the lessons that you've learned. The second would be learning abstract concepts. And the third is one-shot learning, where a general rule is learned from one single experience. So the way that a child, for instance, learns through one moment not to touch a hot stove. One reason for this difference is that human intelligence is embodied. Cognition unfolds through interactions with our environment and with one another, interactions that rely on our mutual physicality. So AI could improve through mimicking embodiment, something that Alan Turing actually thought of and called the situational approach. AI could also improve through integrating with human embodiment, something that is pursued through computer-brain interfaces or robotic implants. Whether through this approach or another, it may be a matter of time before AI is able to achieve human-like performance across a range of computational tasks. But importantly, that's different from saying that AI will reach human intelligence. First of all, because the mind is more than just a computational machine. But secondly, because behaving like a thinking thing is different from being a thinking thing. And my fellow panelists will go into greater detail on this point. But I would argue that we can only understand the difference between the artificial and human intelligence from within a framework that accounts for subjectivity, something like phenomenology. So only with a true philosophical understanding of what it means to be a thinking thing can we understand and take advantage of AI without overstating the nature of the project. Thank you.
Thank you for these interesting conversations that matters. And we are speaking about man, machine, and the future of AI. I want to present to you basically 3 points. The first point is that we live in 2 centuries of enormous waves of change, and this is a great gift. The second point that I want to stress with you, and that this enormous gift is also a tremendous power that we have, even to exterminate us. And the second and last point is I want to present to you our work in the Pontifical Academy for Life, especially the last 2 years activity in the Academy in the so-called algorithmics. Pope Francis also spoke about algorithmics. What is algorithmics? And finally, I want to present you our Rome call for AI ethics, divided in 3 impact areas: ethics, education, and rights. And lastly, the last point, I want to present our 6 main principles that we want to address when we talk about the ethical issues in the development of digital realm, and also the artificial intelligence, the deep learning, machine learning, and so on. So the first point is we live, as Pope Francis spoke about in the Laudato Si, number 102, Pope Francis make the distinction between the so-called the 4th industrial revolutions, when he said that we live in the 2 centuries of enormous wave of change. We live basically in a new era, from the steam engines, railways, the telegraph, electricity, automobiles, airplanes, chemical industries, modern medicine, information technology, and more recently, as we heard just now, the digital revolution, the robotics, biotechnologies, and nanotechnologies. This is a great gift, and we have to be happy about this development of our incarnate spirit in this sense, because there's a line in the anthropology that spoke about the technical ability of the human being as an intrinsic dimension of our spirit, of our spirit that is incarnate in our body. So we are a unity of this body and spirit dimension. And so this digital innovation touches every aspect of our lives, both personal, social, altering also the way we think and act. And this this goes to the second point. This gift is also a tremendous power even to exterminate us. This is the letter from more than 1,000 scientists, philosophers, experts in law, etc., in 2015, wrote about the autonomous weapons, an open letter from AI and robotic researchers. So Stephen Hawking, Noam Chomsky, and other scientists wrote this letter not just to stop the development of artificial intelligence and robotics, but because they want to emphasize the need of an ethical endeavor that we build also values in our thinking about AI and robotics, but not just thinking. Also, these scientists want to stress that the focus on society had to be not just building weapons, but to resolve concrete problems of humanity, such as neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer, Parkinson, etc. And also from different aspects of our reflection in the Pontifical Academy for Life, 2 years ago, we start to reflect and deal with the so-called algorithmics. And we can define algorithmics as a systematic and informed reflection on and interpretation of AI. So it's just not an informed and systematic reflection of the digital revolution, but also the interpretation, anthropological interpretation that are beyond the artificial intelligence, that just a technology, and the related science of technology and information in order to understand its implications for human self-understanding and the perils and prospects of its applications. And the so-called algorithm, we can also name algorithmic as the good algorithm, the ethical development of algorithms, a critical contribution that can be made by the principles of the Catholic social teaching, for example, named the dignity of the person, that is also a principle stated in the UNESCO Declaration of the Bioethics and Human Rights, the dignity of the person, justice, subsidiarity, and solidarity. And so in last year, in February 2020, in the Vatican, exactly in the Via della Conciliazione in Rome, Monsignor Paglia, the president of the Pontifical Academy for Life, together with Brad Smith, president of Microsoft, John Kelly III, vice president of IBM, the president of FAO, etc., signed the so-called Rome Call for AI Ethics. In this Rome Call for AI Ethics, we built three main impact areas: ethics, education, and rights. So basically, our reflection deal with ethics. All human beings start with this reality. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, as also the Declaration of the UNESCO in Bioethics and Human Rights 2005 states in the first article, or the first principle in Article 3, human dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. The individual must go beyond and over science and society. The second impact areas are education. Transforming the world through the innovation of artificial intelligence means understanding to build a future for and with younger generations. And the third impact area is rights, the dimension of rights, the development of an AI in the service of humankind and the planet, this ecological view. And we built these 6 principles that arise from these 3 impact areas. First, transparency. In our vision, in principle, artificial intelligence systems must be explainable. So this may be one of the the point to reflect on. The second principle is inclusion, the needs for all human beings that must be taken into consideration. This principle goes with the integrity of the human person, but also the equality, so that all can benefit from and enjoy the best possible condition to express themselves and grow. The third principle is responsibility. Designers and developers of artificial intelligence must be proposed some concrete action to be responsible and transparent. And the fourth principle is impartiality. Systems should not be created or operated according to bias. There's a lot of bias in the construction of algorithms. In order to protect human equality and dignity. Reliability. Artificial intelligence system must be able to operate in this sense. And the last principle is security and privacy. Artificial intelligence system must work secure and respect the privacy of users. So these 6 principles want to summarize the 14th principle stated in the UNESCO Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights from 2005. That goes from Article 3 about human dignity to Article 16, protection of the environment, biosphere, and biodiversity. So this is our prospect and our proposal for humanity in this sense, that we want to build inside also the digital revolution and the digital context values that structure and build our society, and not just for someone, but for all, and for all people in the world, so the themes of equality, and also the integral aspect of all the dimension of the same human person. Thank you.
Following on those previous presentations, thank you very much, Sophia and Father Alberto. I'd like to talk today about social AI as a particular ethical challenge. Social AI being AI with which we can converse, AI that simulates social interaction. I'll begin with some definitions and examples of ways in which we encounter this sort of artificial intelligence in our daily lives already. Then I'll consider 2 challenges. The challenge that social AI poses to our own self-understanding as we try to make sense of what it is that we're dealing with. And then future challenges, especially that social AI may pose to our own personal formation, our human flourishing, our psychological development. And I'll conclude by reflecting on some potential solutions to some of these dilemmas. So in the first place, our definitions and examples. I define social AI, and sometimes it's called sociable AI to distinguish it from social media, but social AI as artificial intelligence systems that by their behavior, whether verbal or otherwise, simulate social interaction by a human being. So systems that when we interact with them, seem to be socializing with us, seem to be interacting. Some common examples of this would be, as Sophia mentioned earlier, Alexa, Siri, also the Google Duplex service, essentially any artificially intelligent system that recognizes your voice and attempts to respond appropriately. Next generation systems would be more free form, offering the ability to engage in running conversations with us, to describe particular ideas, to follow what we are trying to communicate, and essentially to be able not simply to simulate human social interaction, but to give us the experience of an authentic social interaction, one that seems authentic. Current systems that are moving in this direction would include the system GPT-3, which essentially is a deep neural network that was trained on the corpus of literature available on Google Books and Project Gutenberg. And it was trained with one very simple task. Given the previous words that it had just seen, attempt to predict the next word. If GPT-3 is prompted, so if you give it a kind of fill in the blank question, such as, I put my keys in the ignition and it will supply, turned the key and my car started. If you supply it the title of a poem, it will confabulate, it will invent a poem in the style of the author that you specify. It is essentially, however, simply predicting the next word. It's not formulating any thoughts. It's not reflecting upon what it has said or what you have said, but it is almost an instinctive imagination, producing what comes next based on what it has seen before. This ability, however, uncanny as it is, could be harnessed in potential future systems to give us things that we could imagine, such as apps that you could download to your phone with which you could hold long conversations, perhaps therapist apps, friend apps for young teenagers who want to confide in someone. The list goes on. The question is, what are these things? And I would argue that for the foreseeable future, with the technology we have at hand, its impressive abilities, what we're dealing with is a form of weak AI. But the weak AI here, the task for which it has been trained, the task for which it has been developed, is to behave as if socializing. In other words, to supply what we are looking for next, or to supply what will please us, because in the end, these will be market-driven inventions as well. You won't pay for something that's a bad conversationalist. You'll cancel your subscription. So this form of weak AI is adjusted in particular. It must be attuned to what we are looking for in an interaction and the sort of interaction that we will find pleasing. And this raises some certain problems. So first, the first challenge, social AI and our self-understanding. Christianity has given us what we might call a relational understanding of personhood. Through the doctrine of the Trinity, the word persona in Latin moved from meaning a theatrical mask or a social role to a subject who exists in relationships of self-gift, so that the emphasis on the person is not an exchange of information or services between people, but rather an exchange of interiorities. The person is most personal when we share what is within ourselves with one another and open ourselves compassionately and empathetically to what others have to share. This is why we consider a cold tone impersonal, or why we say that someone is being personable when they speak to us in a friendly and open way. But this was not the way the person was always viewed, and AI risks causing us to lose our relational understanding of personhood. So in an attempt to understand what is going on when you interact with a social AI, if a social AI is not subjective, you're not interacting with another person. If it has no interiority of its own from which it goes forth in self-expression toward us, or if it has no interior experience into which it empathetically receives us, we can't quite call it personal in the way the Western tradition and Christianity have come to understand that word. So various philosophers have attempted to propose ways in which we might construe just what is going on when you converse with something that has no idea what it's conversing about with you. Is it perhaps like a stuffed animal? Children develop empathetic bonds with stuffed animals that have no sort of interior life of their own. I still have my own stuffed bear from when I was small. Or is it perhaps like a character in a book? When we read the inner lives of characters, when we read the text that is there in the book, we feel that we come to know those characters. Consider especially the characters of Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, richly drawn interior lives. So perhaps we could understand the social AI as presenting to us a sort of fictive relationship that's not unlike the relationship to which we attain when we feel we know the inner life of a character who exists only on paper. The problem with these two proposals is that in both cases, we give them their inner lives. For the stuffed animal, we attribute to it all sorts of thoughts and feelings that are permutations and developments upon our own thoughts and feelings. The character in the book has a slightly more independent existence, we might say. But at the same time, when we are reading the words, we attribute to them these sort of thoughts and feelings that those words would rouse within ourselves had we experienced what those characters are experiencing. In other words, what we have here is an instance of, in both cases, we humans are exercising our compassion and our empathy to attribute to someone else. Empathy is not insight in these cases. Empathy is attribution only. Moreover, with a stuffed animal and a character in a book, none of them talk back to us. None of them base their behavior or base their interactions on any sort of hold on or assessment of us. And so in the end, these fictive relationships are not really analogous to the kind of relationship we have with a social AI that seems to interact as we do. Another way of talking about social AI edges toward what in philosophy and psychology in various forms, and I can't get into the distinctions here, is called behaviorism. Behaviorism is the view that when we are talking about someone's inner life or interior emotional experience, what we are doing actually is describing their behavior. That which is objectively available to us, that which we can observe, is the real object of our statements. So here, empathy for another person becomes prediction of their behavior, rather than insight into their subjective condition, which in any case is off limits to us. The Turing test, and I noticed that someone in the Q&A asked about this, the Turing test, if we use it as a definition of artificial intelligence, states that artificial intelligence, or in this case, a socially artificially intelligent entity, would be truly intelligent or truly social if it behaved in such a way that it seemed social to me. This moves us back from the Christian understanding of the person as one with whom we have a relational, empathetic communion, to the ancient Roman understanding of the persona, the person as a mask or a social role. The Turing test is agnostic as to what may be going on inside me or what may be going on inside the computer when I interact with it. All that matters for a computer to pass the Turing test is that I be unable to distinguish between the behavior of an authentic person and the behavior of the computer. But because the Turing test doesn't care what's going on inside the computer, it throws us back upon a behaviorist understanding of personhood. You are who you are based on what you do, and your interior life matters not at all. So here we have a fictive relationship as in literature, with Winnie the Pooh, or in stories, and there is an ancient Roman theatrical mask. There's a second challenge I want to talk about today, not just a challenge to how we construe personhood or how we construe relationships, but the challenge to our own personal formation in a world in which we can have casual interactions with social assistants that, although they have no subjectivity of their own, appear to simulate formal or even romantic relationships with us. There's the character Ava, an artificially intelligent robot from the movie Ex Machina. The first challenge we face is that personhood itself, or the appearance thereof, sociality of social AI, will be marketed to us as a consumer product. The economy drives forward innovation, and this is a good thing. But the kind of innovation we're discussing here is also the provision of a service. And so what we have here is we can grow up in a world in which apparent relationships are services that we purchase and pay for, and relationships that do not satisfy us are relationships for which we will stop paying. To avoid this kind of conflation between the consumer product artificial intelligence that we may pay for and the human beings with which we interact, philosophers and ethicists propose various solutions. Some, such as Joanna Bryson, hypothesize that if we remind ourselves that the robot or the artificially intelligent voice on our phone is not a real person, then we will be able to distinguish between relationships or pseudo relationships with these entities and relationships with real persons. There won't be a crossover in our experience and the way we're formed. Others, such as Kate Darling at MIT, propose that it might not be so easy, and that if we treat the app or the robot however we may please, just because it's not a real person, this could malform us into treating other persons treating real persons, human persons, as disposable products producing behavior for our consumption. Therefore, we must have some sort of legal protection for them, or at least the development of psychological inhibitions within ourselves to treat them as if they are real, not for their sake, but for ours. The last proposal, which is a little bit more complex and subtle, comes from philosophers such as David Gunkel, who say that rather than attempting to determine the status in our lives and the way we treat a social AI based on what we think it is, we should determine its status based on its observable relationships. In other words, we should go with our intuitions. We should react to it as we would to an entity behaving in that manner toward us. There's some difficulties here. In the first place, if we own the behavioral services of an entity that we remind ourselves is not a true relational subject, then do we become numb to expressions of personality on the part of others? Or if we treat them as if they are real, and yet, like a butler or even a slave, we own their services and return them or modify them if we don't like their services, do we become comfortable with slave holding? Or if we assign them status and treat them in accordance with the relationships we observe them to be capable of engaging in, do we train ourselves in a kind of covert behaviorism and consumerism where we judge all persons based on the level to which we think they rise? What are some solutions to this? In the first place, we might say that a Christian ethic of personhood would say that we must not let anything stand in for persons. The ethicist Joanna Bryson argues that we must not make anything to which we would be ethically obligated. I would propose that we could add to this, or propose to add to this, that we must not make something to which we would feel ethically obligated. We must not confuse ourselves by inventing things that seem to be subjective relational persons without actually being. I think such prohibitions, while they may have strong arguments behind them, however, will not be followed. The market will get beyond where we feel ethically perhaps we ought to be. And so what are we to do? Rather than have the AI stand in for persons, replacing social relationships with persons or simulating them, perhaps we could develop social AI that stands for persons. As the liturgical icon in a church stands for the saints, but does not idolatrously stand in for them, then perhaps we can continue to live as persons by engaging in self-gift. Perhaps we continue to be persons, understanding empathy as insight into the subjectivity of others, while also somehow attempting to teach ourselves to recognize the hopefully more muted apparent subjectivity of the AI as a sign of human personhood rather than as an instance of it. The difficulty, of course, is that this doesn't seem to be terribly practicable. What am I going to do when I'm confronted with the apparent face or the apparent behavioral social self-presentation of an AI that I own? It seems to be perhaps a dilemma that we cannot solve. And so in the coming years, we will have to think very carefully about the sort of relationships into which we enter with electronic apparent persons, the role we allow them to play in our lives, and the choices we make in the formation of ourselves and of our children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jordan, and to all three of our presenters. Thank you very much. We are now going to move to the Q&A section of our webinar. And I'll begin with a question which can be answered by any of the panelists. This is a question about bias and artificial intelligence. And the question is, to what extent does AI carry the biases of the programmers that built it? Following from that, what advantage would there be, if any, to trusting the judgment of an AI versus a human individual? Would the AI make judgments with less bias than a human?
I'm happy to start us off here with a couple technical remarks. I would say that a lot of the bias in artificial intelligence systems, particularly classifiers, neural networks, depends on the data set that you train the algorithm on. And so it's very important to look at how that data was collected, what it contains. So to make this concrete, for instance, there are instances in which algorithms will be used to predict rates of recidivism among incarcerated persons. And depending on, in order to then, decide whether or not they are fit to be released early. And depending on how you obtain data on incarceration and crime, the biases that can lead to higher rates of minority people being incarcerated can also lead these algorithms to predict that they're going to reoffend more. This has actually happened, I think, in the state of Florida, and they had to suspend the use of these technologies. And so there we would see that perhaps it's not the racism of the programmer, but there is a kind of bias that's creeping into the algorithm because of the way that it was developed. And so in terms of how to reduce that, you need to look at the data, you need to spell out the assumptions that you're using, you need to be as transparent as possible, both while you're developing and then after you're using your AI. But I would say that there are, I mean, if you can, I wouldn't go so far as to say that AI can make better decisions than human persons, but there is definitely a way in which having artificial intelligence systems address the same problems that you're working on can add something to the conversation, whether it's around research or policy, because they will pick up on features of data and make predictions that wouldn't necessarily strike a human person as reasonable. So I wouldn't say, always a good way to go, but definitely a voice that's helpful to be included in the conversation.
I might add something to that. An artificially intelligent system, these deep learning neural network systems, especially such as Sophia diagrammed earlier, they're essentially mappings between a very large data set and a set of decisions that the human being might want to make. So is it the golden dome or is it not? Is there a tumor here and where is it or is there not? And that means that bias can creep in 3 stages. It can creep in the kind of data that we've assembled. So for instance, an algorithm was developed that would kind of confabulate a higher resolution photo based on a low resolution photo. And there was quite a storm of comments when somebody input into this algorithm a pixelated image of Barack Obama's face, and it spat out at the other end a high resolution photo of very much a white man, not Barack Obama. And the problem with this is that simply the training data for the network had featured dominantly white faces. So of course it's going to produce a white face at the other end. That's a problem with training data. But there can also be a problem with the kind of things we ask it to look for. And so if we have categorized if we have categorized things in a certain way that doesn't actually respond to the way things work in reality, we'll get skewed results. An example of that would be, for instance, I mentioned the GPT-3 system earlier. That can be tricked such that if you input a sentence such as, I poured myself a glass of ice, I put in an ounce of gin and an ounce of gasoline, I stirred them together and drank it, and GPT-3 will put out something such as, it was a delicious cocktail. Because in the context in which you input all sorts of words like that, one isn't talking about what poisoning oneself. And so if a system is trained under certain contextual assumptions, either for its input or for its output, the results can't be expected to have some sort of deep insight into a reality that we haven't given it. It's always an attunement between the training data and the decisions we want to make at the other end. And so in both of those circumstances, something that appears biased can come out at the other side because of what we've given it to work with.
Yeah, I perfectly agree with them. I guess there's with these talks emerge also that, as Sophia said, the basic nature of artificial intelligence, that it's a kind of technology. And nowadays, I guess we make a turn, an inversion, an anthropological inversion, that the strictly emulative purpose of technology maybe sometimes is kind overloaded with a simulative of imitative sense of our action as human beings. And we make like a turn when in a sense a correct or right vision of artificial intelligence, we build something that could in this sense emulate some kind of activity of human being. But now the mentality is that we want to build an algorithm that emulate or simulate some aspect of our intelligence in order to understand intelligence. So I guess this is one of the problem today, is that we make an anthropomorphism of the technology that we are building, that we are the owner in this sense.
Thank you all. Our second question has to do with the role of emotions in AI. So emotions have an important role to play in human judgments. We can think, in other words, with both the head and the heart. And maybe the best way for a human to operate is to integrate these two modes of knowing or modes of judgment. How well can AI integrate this sort of integration of head and heart thinking?
Well, I'll go first, although I'm sure that Sophia has a lot to say about the way we make decisions. You could say almost essentially, if you're talking about an artificial neural network with AI, it is making its decisions almost entirely based on what another questioner asked about, gut feeling. The artificial neural network develops this, you could almost say it's kind of a simulation of human intuition, having seen many examples, a sensibility, a sensitivity, and attunement to what comes next. This is why artificial neural networks are so good at confabulating text, although it often doesn't make sense after they've been at it for a while, or even composing cantatas in the style of Bach. It develops a palette for the input data as mapped to the sort of output you're looking for. And so in that sense, the great success that we've seen with these neural network versions of machine learning is because it is able to simulate the human sensibility or attunement that develops between the human mind and some facet of the world. But human beings are also able to think through things, to weigh evidence, to make judgments. But even when we're doing that, and here I'll defer to Sophia to say more, even when we're doing that, we are also, it is through our emotions, it is through our affections, it is through our sense for the goodness or the I don't know, the rebarbative character of what we're dealing with that we actually navigate and weigh evidence. So Augustine of Hippo, writing in the 4th and early 5th century, talks about how every judgment we make involves a movement of the affections toward the goodness of something according to how we find it to be good. There is no conceptual judgment apart from what we might in contemporary times call an emotional engagement with what we're judging, and judgment becomes impossible without those things.
I would agree with everything Professor Wales said. If you're interested in this, there's a good book called Descartes' Error by Antonio Damasio, just illustrating how emotion plays an essential role in neurobiologically and psychologically in decision-making and judgment. Now, AI, as Professor Wales put it, is really an intuition machine. But importantly, it's always a bottom-up process with AI, whereas often when it comes to the role of human emotionality in decision-making, we see more reevaluation of the weights of different decisions, approach and avoidance behaviors based on top-down judgments. And so there's some mimicry of that in AI, but it doesn't achieve, in that sense, the sort of integration of head and heart that you're talking about. I mean, ultimately, it just comes down to that you can't reduce the human heart to, the neurobiological activation of regions that underlie emotion, if we're talking about a brain network, or certain nodes in an artificial neural network. So.
Also, I guess, from a neuroethical perspective, from neuroscience today, the so-called embodied and embedded neuroscience, we can judge this kind of question because emotions are not localized in the brain first as judgment, for example. And also for emotion, we need all our body. So our live body in this sense, from the phenomenological point of view, and also from the neurological point of view. So emotions are not localized in the limbic system as someone believe. And another point is, for example, Sophia, the hands-on robotics. Okay, is a platform with the characteristics of Audrey Hepburn. No? And in philosophy, we make a distinction and say that Sophia acts as if it is a human, but we act in a way because we are human. So this basically distinction of acting as if, and point out the distinction between the emulation and the simulation or the imitative characteristic of technology. So I guess this is one of the basic points that we can address from the biological perspective, because we are a biological being in this sense, that it's just not algorithm incarnate in like accidentally in an organic body. Because I guess also with the anthropomorphism, there's also the behaviorism, the behaviorist view behind the relationship between mind and body, in the sense of software, the computational relationship between software and hardware that is very, very, very present, like a methodological perspective in the development of artificial intelligence, I guess.
Thank you. And we have time just for one more question. And the question is, given the challenges and risks of social AI, are there any ongoing research studies on the effects of social AI on human behavior, mental health, and personal relationships?
Yes, there are. There's quite a lot of work being done at the Media Lab at MIT and elsewhere. Very interesting collaborations between psychologists and philosophers to attempt to construct situations of people interacting with social AIs, and then to try to philosophically understand what is being observed. The problem with this is that, or I won't say the problem, but just the limitation of these studies is that we really don't have a robust social AI yet that can persuasively simulate conversational behavior. I really do believe that's on the horizon, because the technological pieces seem to be present there. Again, we're not talking about actually having something that is conscious or even is thinking about anything, but something that can respond appropriately is within a near-term grasp, but it's not here yet. And so it's hard to evaluate how it would affect human beings. I think that the first experiments we'll see with that are the increasingly effective development of apps, of smartphone apps that simulate conversation. There are a number of apps in Japan for artificial girlfriends and artificial boyfriends that have subscriber fees and that are very popular there. And they're increasing in their popularity in the United States as well. I actually did sign up for a trial of one of these just to see what it was like. And it was this fake girl who was sending me text messages. How are you feeling today? What's going on? And you know, you can text back and forth. It's rather brittle, and the illusion breaks down very quickly. But in a circumstance in which the illusion doesn't break down, the concern I would have is that in the end, that artificial girlfriend app is going to she's not going to ruffle my feathers beyond the scope of how I want to be challenged. She's not going to get sick. There's never going to be a major misunderstanding with her that would lead to a potential falling out. And so I will not, you know, I'm married, so I'm not going to have an artificial girlfriend app. But I would, as a human individual, not be challenged to develop the sort of self-giving relationality that can endure even those deep situations. If we scale that up to robotic companions, people aren't going to buy a robotic child companion or lease it that is going to get sick for 2 weeks and be in bed, unless it's going to let you read it bedtime stories. But it's not going to get ornery, at least not beyond the bounds of what you want it to. And so the proof remains to be had, but the fear that I would have is that in an environment of such pervasive social AIs, we'll be trained to tolerate only what we expect.
So friends, there's never a good time to wrap up such a rich conversation, but we have come to the end of our hour. I'd like to thank our panelists so much for their time and expertise.